right, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Molly Silberberg, and I work at BAM in our humanities department, where I work on our discussions and our literary programming. We are so thrilled to be one of the Brooklyn Book Festival's cultural and programming partners and to be part of today's exciting lineup of events. Today's discussion will focus on Joan Didion's 1979 essay collection, The White Album, a masterpiece in which memoir, political examination, and cultural criticism intersect, and the way in which the essay is viewed and engaged with as a form today. This discussion is being presented in conjunction with BAM's 2018 Next Wave Festival, where Lars Jan Early Morning Opera's theatrical adaptation will be presented from October 28th to November 1st. You can visit BAM's website for tickets and more information. I'm so grateful to have with us today an incredible panel of authors to look at Didion's seminal work. We have Alexander Chee, who is a novelist and essayist. His most recent essay collection is How to Write an Autobiographical Novel. He is an associate professor of English and creative writing at Dartmouth College. Morgan Jerkins is the author of the New York Times bestseller, This Will Be My Undoing. Her work has been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Rolling Stone, The Atlantic, and Elle, among many others. She's based in Harlem. And Meghan O'Rourke, who will be both participating and facilitating today's conversation, is a poet and nonfiction writer. She's the author of the poetry collections Sun and Days, Once, and Half-Life, as well as The Long Goodbye, her best-selling memoir about the death of her mother. She is the recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship and writes for The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Atlantic, and others. She teaches in the MFA program at NYU. There will be some time for questions at the end of the conversation, and I also want to say a special hello to our audiences who are tuning in live right now. And finally, I wanted to let you know that Greenlight Bookstore will have books available for sale downstairs, and our authors will be signing following the program. Except for Meghan, you can catch after her next program taking place in here at noon, so come back an hour later to get your books signed by her. With that, I'm going to turn it right on over.
Great, or come fast. Hi, thanks for coming, all of you. And I'm really excited to be here with these two wonderful writers to talk about Didion's The White Album, which I've been rereading and having a slightly new experience of. That essay famously begins with her quote, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live," which we'll dig into a little bit. And the title essay has become a classic essay of the kind of paranoid disquiet and social chaos of the late 1960s, in which she describes her own nervous breakdown. And it's that eye for the contradictions of our cultural myths that has led some to call her an American genius. And I want to come back to that line in a minute, because I think it gets complicated in that essay in ways that we forget about. But before we do anything like that, just let's out ourselves. Fans, non-fans? Do we love her? What's our Didion position at the moment? What has she meant to your practice, too, even more seriously?
So I remember seeing her when after Henry came out, I think, and it was at Brentano's bookstore in New York, and she stood on the Brentano's doesn't exist anymore. If you're half of you probably remember the store, and half of you are like, "What is he talking about?" In any case, there was a stairs going up to the top, and there was a sort of middle area that they had her podium set up on, and she came out like a Vita in a brown tweed Chanel suit, which I think is like her superhero costume.
Yeah.
I think it's what she puts on to perform Joan Didion.
Yeah.
And she was wearing her sunglasses, of course. And she said, "I'm just going to read a little something I wrote about Patricia Hearst." And then we all freaked out. And then she read it. And so, yeah, I'm a big fan. I remember going up to get my book signed. We were allowed to approach 3 at a time. Morgan's like, "Idea." And I said to her, "I'm just one of the thousands of gay men who worship everything you write." And she laughed in this very startled way. And then I left, and I felt very happy at having made her laugh. So yeah. fan.
It's kind of hard to follow up with that.
Yeah.
I'm a fan, but I'm like level 1. You know, when you're starting a video game and like you see your character like gearing up to fight. Yeah, that's me. So when I moved to New York, I saw a lot of writers, particularly female writers, kept referencing goodbye to all of that, but just saying goodbye to all of that. And I'm like, what are they saying goodbye to? Like, what's going on? And so then I read Goodbye to All That. And then I read her essay on self-respect, which is one of my favorite essays of all time. And so when I was preparing to write my first book, I read Slouching Towards Bethlehem, which I really loved. And because my next book is like a hybrid of reportage and personal narrative, this event came at like an auspicious time because I'm trying to see how the greats do it. So yeah, I really appreciate her style.
I want to dig into some things you said. I'll just say very quickly, my first encounter with Joan Didion was I had read, my mother gave me After Henry, and I remember being very struck by the Central Park, the essay about the Central Park Five in that book. And then she came to a writing class I took in college, and it wasn't just her, it was her and her husband, the writer John Gregory Dunn, and all the female students, we're going to circle back to the gendered obsessions and others' obsessions, but we were deeply excited to see her, I think as a kind of model for what we might aspire to. And she came with John Gregory Dunn, and she's very tiny and he was large, and she had her sunglasses on, and she sat, and he spoke the entire time. And she said about 3 words, and yet her presence was somehow, those words were like the most illuminating words of the entire time. And he was lovely and wonderful, and clearly this was how she wanted it, but it was this fascinating dynamic, which I bring up because there's a similarly fascinating dynamic in her essays where she both gives herself to us and doesn't, I think. Which maybe we can talk to. But I want to come back to what you were saying about the blend of memoir and cultural criticism. This is what Didion does formally that is so distinctive, I think, or certainly was so distinctive in the late 60s and in the 70s, which is to write cultural criticism that uses tiny bits of memoir to illuminate. She turns herself into the lens through which we, her nervous breakdown in the White Album, it seems to me, becomes the lens through which we experience the larger breakdown of the 1960s. Her sense that she had gone off a script, as she put it, is really about everyone going off a script. And I just wondered if you might talk a little bit about how it feels to read that kind of hybrid text today. Do you feel that we're seeing that in the essay right now? Do you see that? What kind of space has she opened? What kind of space has she claimed? Are others doing it as well as she did? I'm just curious about your thoughts about all that.
Oh, well, I'll say that whenever I read an essay or a work that combines cultural criticism and personal narrative, I always feel full and affirmed. And the reason why I feel that way is because we don't exist in a vacuum. So things are affecting us even if we don't think they are affecting us. And I feel like even more so moving to New York, you're interacting with stimuli all the time. So that, seeing that affirmed in literature is helpful for me, to see how, you combine different things that are going on in your life and in the larger work as well. As far as writers who I think that do that today, I would say Rachel Kadziganza does that. I love her. She's just amazing. And she won the Pulitzer off of a piece that she wrote on Dylan Roof. And not only does she write about visiting his father and being in the courtroom when the verdict was held, she also talks about her place as a black woman in the South. And, these drunken white women are like trying to fetch her attention so that she will get their car for them. And you were like, well, why is she bringing it up? Because you have to. Because you have to recognize your place and what you're doing at all times, even more so when you are in minority, in her case, a double minority. So, yeah, I think that, Joan Didion has sort of opened up that hybridity. And also, it doesn't have to be resolute either. So when I was reading the White Album, a lot of times I had to catch myself because I'm like, I want these definitive answers. And for a time in the 60s, there is no, I don't think there was any definitive answers. There's a whole lot of chaos that's going on. And that's too much responsibility, even on someone as, innovative as she is, to be like, I need you to solve everything for me, because she's trying to tease it out herself, hence the purpose of this book.
can I jump in with, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and Alex, maybe this is a segue to you too, like, I was so struck by how that form of that essay, and we were chatting about this a little bit earlier, is it's in fragments. I don't know if any of you remember. It's in these sections that are somewhat, and they kind of use juxtaposition. And this time I was struck by, I use that line all the time, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. And I was struck by the fact that by the end of that, she hasn't quite told a story, right? The story she's telling is a story of non-story. And that was really interesting in terms of what you're saying about the slight wanting more resolution and not quite getting it. But yeah, Alex.
There was a moment I had when I was rereading it in preparation for this where I thought to myself that I don't think when I first read it in my 20s that I had fully apprehended how traumatic it was to live through a period where you saw MLK, JFK, and RFK all assassinated in the way that they were, for example. It was that sense of the violence that she talks about, understanding the power that is present at the end of a gun when she's talking about the Black Panthers. Yeah. Now she can understand that. And she talks about, there's that very chilling scene where she's looking at the transcript of Huey Newton as he's trying to get himself admitted to the hospital, and he's bleeding, and this woman is trying to insist that he's actually covered by Kaiser before she will allow him into the hospital, and how she didn't apprehend until she had done some reporting that he was in fact covered by Kaiser, that the whole conversation was a kind of had a different context than she understood. And I felt in some ways that she was, this style that she has of presenting things and not quite telling you what to think about it and allowing you to have your own thoughts about it is, I think, now called Protestant writing, which feels very dated to say in 2018. But it was how it was presented to me in the 80s when I was a writing student. Oh, really? And I think what you're saying about like this person at this place and this time, speaking out of that moment, is something that we also, I think, for a long time thought belonged in the novel and not in the essay and not in reporting. And so what she's doing in a sense is she's taking the way in which in a personal essay the writer is the instrument and the creator both, and turning that into a way to look at the world, or at least try to, and the diagnosis that she gets actually in the White Album, it had eluded me for a long time. She's diagnosed with MS. Yeah. And so
I have totally forgotten that.
The context for the sunglasses now, which, I think are considered iconic and even an affectation, and people, either love it or they find it off-putting, but she has MS, and that was a fascinating, it's been right there the whole time, and I think her legend has become big enough that I don't even know sometimes when people talk about liking her or not liking her, if they're even really talking about her.
I think that's such an important point, that the sort of mythos of Didion, Didionesque has become its own adjective of choice as a critical adjective. I just want to read the end of that section that you were mentioning, because I think it illuminates something about her style and what we're talking about. She writes, after talking about Huey Newton being wounded during the gunfire that killed John Fry, she says, "For a long time I kept a copy of this testimony," that's the testimony you were citing, "pinned to my office wall on the theory that it illustrated a collision of cultures, a classic instance of a historical outsider confronting the established order at its most petty and impenetrable level. This theory was shattered when I learned that Huey Newton was in fact an enrolled member of the Kaiser Foundation Health Plan, i.e., in Nurse Leonard's words, a Kaiser." And there we see what you're talking about, that not quite telling you what to think, that the developing of a theory and then a slight holding back, saying it's shattered, but not saying what is replaced
Right, what replaces it, yeah.
Right. So, you talked a little bit about relating to her as a young person, and it was funny rereading the book this time, maybe particularly in this moment of cultural divisiveness. I had the feeling that actually she's a writer you can't fully appreciate until you're middle-aged. That might be the narcissism of the middle. That might be like trying to salvage something for myself as I age. I will admit that. But I was like, oh, there's so much I didn't even pay attention to because I was so busy connecting to the moments in Goodbye to All That I could relate to, the moments in the White Album. This work is so much more complicatedly political, astringent, and sometimes challenging in ways that I knew but I wasn't engaging with deeply. And I wonder if you might talk about why you think Didion, I mean, we're starting to get at it, but why does she cast this beguiling spell over us at so many different stages as writers? What obviously the new journalism techniques you're talking about, the bringing of herself in as a subject, I think is part of it, but is there anything else you've been struck by
there's
formally?
about 3 or 4 Joan Didions, right,
Yeah.
at this point.
Yeah.
And I think what we see in the White Album is her moving away from who she used to be.
Yeah.
She has that sort of much quoted line about not quite being in touch with several people I used to be.
Yeah.
Which might even be is that in On Respect?
I
On
think
Self-Respect?
so.
Excuse me.
And in the White Album, she talks about going off script, her own
Right.
script.
And the script, I think, is interesting, especially in light of that moment that you mentioned about her and John Gregory Dunn and how she's sort of not saying anything while he's saying everything. I think one thing that struck me about reading this time is that she was someone who was very aware that she was a class traitor, in a sense, in one way, and also yet not quite able to be comfortable with that, and that some of her discomfort was simply about not being what she had always been told she should be, and both needing to be that in order to be herself, and yet still feeling uncomfortable with that. And I think that's something that we see her shed in her later work. One of my favorite Didion essays is what I consider like middle Didion, on Lakewood, which is Trouble in Lakewood, which is where she writes about the horrifying sexual assault of a disabled girl in Lakewood, California, and the town and the team as well. And she's writing about essentially how all of this, the whole culture of the place had conspired to, in a sense, cooperate with this assault. Now, she's talked about wanting to move away from the focus on herself, and in that essay you can really see that she has. Here in the White Album, I think the presence of herself that we find so compelling in many ways is exactly what troubles her, and is what she seems almost like she's unsure of whether she belongs. And I think that's what makes it still a very interesting essay, because she's thinking, we're watching her think, even if she doesn't quite arrive at a conclusion.
Or that's the conclusion in some way.
Yeah, I did sense that there was like this sort of tension when she would go visit certain people, like, Nancy Reagan, or going, just doing the research on the Manson murders. And I was like, there seems to be not necessarily at ease, but then how could you be because of what's going on, but how much you sort of inject yourself into the work that you're doing. Because me, like, I mean, personally, when I used to think about journalism, I always thought it was just strictly laying out the facts, putting it into a narrative, and then file it. And in that way, it sort of limited me as a person who's, doing the story, because, like, I was the one that was there. So how do I extricate myself and tell you the story? Whereas, like, even as a reader, on the opposite, I'm like, well, what drew this writer to this story to begin with,
Right, and what subjectivity and subject position do they bring? I'm so interested reading her right now because, for 2 reasons. One, I think for me, one thing that fascinates endlessly is the way, and this quote is part of it, that she says at one point, I developed a sense that meaning itself was resident in the rhythms of words and sentences and paragraphs, a technique for withholding whatever it was I believed beneath an increasingly impenetrable polish. At another point she writes, the way I write is who I am or have become, which are genuinely strange things to say, right? The way, I mean, not if you're an artist, I think, it's how artists work. They like.
I was going to say, I find that very
Right.
ordinary.
I don't actually find it strange. I find it so consoling, right? I find it so consoling, but I think that if you're not a writer, it might seem very right.
Well, no, it felt like a riddle.
Right.
Like when she
right.
said that.
Right.
It's like, for me, that type of, when I came across that in the book, I was like, this seems like Alice in Wonderland when
Yeah.
she comes across the Cheshire Cat and the cat just keeps saying something and appearing and reappearing. But I think that also adds to her allure, though.
Totally.
It's like, where can I pinpoint you?
Exactly, that's what I was saying.
And you
That
can.
for me is the allure, the layers of irony, right? That even as she's revealing something about herself, what she's revealing is her history of withholding.
Yes.
Right? And I think that that's just so beguiling, and as is her genuinely novelistic ability telling detail. I think many writers I know, maybe particularly female writers, will recite the smell of jasmine in the air, the yellow curtains at the beginning of Goodbye to All That, these details that she evokes up against some pretty tough political and cultural insights. That, to me, part of what I go back to her for is just that she opened up a space, as you're saying, of connecting things that weren't connected, of juxtaposing things that weren't connected, that feel truer to my experience of what it is to be a writer perceiving the world and wanting to talk about and wanting to think on the page, right? Because that is what she does so brilliantly.
I wondered if we could talk about the packing list, which is one of the
exactly.
famous.
Can we also just hold
moments.
up our books for
Oh,
a second?
sure.
So we all have
We all have different.
and this has the full page Didion on the back.
Oh, that's good.
I don't think there's no author photo here.
Yeah, no.
So the famous packing list. I'm assuming that everybody in here knows it, but I'll read it just for pleasure. To pack and wear: 2 skirts, 2 jerseys or leotards, 1 pullover sweater, 2 pair shoes, stockings, bra, nightgown, robe, slippers, cigarettes, bourbon, bag with shampoo, toothbrush and paste, basis soap, razor, deodorant, aspirin, prescriptions, Tampax, face cream, powder, baby oil, to carry, mohair throw, typewriter, 2 legal pads and pens, files, house key. This is a list which was taped inside my closet door in Hollywood during those years when I was reporting more or less steadily. The list enabled me to pack without thinking for any piece I was likely to do. Note the deliberate anonymity of costume. In a skirt, a leotard, and stockings, I could pass on either side of the culture. Notice the mohair throw for trunk-lined flights, i.e. no blankets, and for the motel room in which the air conditioning could not be turned off. Notice the bourbon for the same motel room. Notice the typewriter for the airport coming home. The idea was to turn in the Hertz car, check in, find an empty bench, and start typing the day's notes. And it's a portrait of a reporter's life, a writer's life. It's a portrait of the person who decides that they're going to carry their own bourbon. It's a
Portrait of control.
of control, yeah.
The attempt at control.
Attempt at control over at least the environment, but also that very brief mention of like how she could pass as someone to either side of the culture. This way that she refers to in various points in her work of being someone who needs to basically just allow people to think that she is other than who she is, or to make use of their misapprehension of her in order to get the details or the interview or the kind of access. It's it made it seem like the most exciting job in the world, to be honest.
She had a knack for the glamorous detail, but I'm struck by what you're saying about passing on either sides, because that is part of what makes Didion Didion, I think, right? That she's in the White Album, in Slouching Toward Bethlehem, you can see the residue of her. She was raised by conservative Republicans. She grew up fairly well-to-do. She's fascinated by her history as a person whose family came west, but she also has, a kind of cultivated skepticism, I think. Not even cultivated, I think it's probably, integral to her as a writer. She's slightly at odds with her family, but she's also slightly at odds with or not even slightly, at odds with the counterculture that she's describing. And it made me wonder what it would be like if a young Joan Didion were writing today, at this moment in time, because there's something about her that, so for example, in the book, The White Album, there's a famous essay about the women's movement, that she is, she's very skeptical about. And I don't know about you, but there were moments I wanted to throw the book against the wall, because I was like, no, that's really not, I understand why you're skeptical of the didacticism of certain things, but on the other hand, that was necessary. And then by the same token, by the end of the essay, she is articulating complexities that roil around in my mind that I have no way of articulating. And she really had this incredibly muscular mind. But anyway, yeah. Do you know what I'm talking about? This kind of push-pull a little bit?
Well, I don't know if it's dense to say it, but I feel like as a writer, you should be suspicious of everything.
Yeah.
Even if you are 100% in agreement with something, always interrogate the why. And yeah, the same thing happened with the women's movement. I'm like, man, she's just like, well, actually in every little detail. But then I was like, but that's what she's supposed to do, because that's why we have these conversations right here. So yeah.
And she was willing to say things that got her pretty well attacked back. I went back and looked at some of the responses in the 70s, and there were a lot of takedowns, actually, which we sort of forget about now.
All of which she has survived.
Yes, all of which she's still here with her glasses.
Yeah, I think last year I taught Where I Was From, which is her interrogation of the myth of the Californian dream. And I found it to be fascinating to think of it in light of this, because that's a book where she actually really dismantles the illusion of California as the settler paradise she really takes apart how disingenuous all of this kind of nativism, essentially, this nativist myth really is, and she does it peg by peg by peg, and I think the point at which she started writing for the New York Review of Books, she really became someone who needed an army of fact checkers for the many things that she would bring out. And what's interesting to me now, I think, is how much of her work is also partly a product of being able to write for magazines who would provide her with the time to do this kind of reporting, and the support of an editor, and the support of copy editors and fact checkers, and all of these things that we have seen some publications chip away at. And it's, I think, worth observing that when you ask the question of like, who is like our new Joan Didion, is actually the question of like, can anybody be one at this point with the way writers are supported now?
Yeah.
Yeah, and she also had the support of Hollywood. Right? She has that famous line about being on, her daughter talking about, are we on expenses? And I was like, I can't imagine my children ever asking that question. They might be like, where's the dime jar?
Right. And I agree. Like, I think, my career, I went through digital media, and I still do it. So I think it's very disconcerting that every other day a new media company is letting go of all of their editorial staff, or editorial, budgets are being severely slashed. So like, if I think about, a young female writer who's able to, I don't know, for example, like, document a highly profile murder case, like which publication is gonna give that woman the money to do that? And it usually spans months. So how are they supposed to live off of that budget as well, especially if the person is living in New York or California? And then I think what even more, just Black women, like, or women of color, like they don't really get the opportunities to do these long form features and get paid well for it. The reason why I have to say that is because I just learned yesterday that some magazines will only pay somebody $100 for a 3,000 word feature. So that's where we're at right now. So that's why I'm like, how do you, it's not even, but I know people have the talent. I'm sure we all know people who have the talent, but where are the systems in place to make sure that person is well supported financially and also has the mentorship through fact checkers and editors and copy editors to make sure that this story is as pristine as it can be.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important. And also be willing to let a writer innovate, trust a writer, trust especially maybe a female writer of color, or trust a writer who doesn't have a certain, who's not a staff writer and they're trying to find and develop a young writer. How do we find, I think one of the issues we're seeing is that online there's so much room to innovate, but people are not being paid, as you're saying. And there is a proliferation of personal writing that I think is wonderful, but I also wonder what it would be like if some of those really talented writers had editors who were pushing them to feel emboldened to talk more assertively about the culture at large.
Well, it's the
way she
right.
does.
It's been, I think, something we've seen, like Gia Tolentino, for example, is someone who I think of as really doing this kind of work and doing it exceptionally well at the New Yorker, and she wrote about the personal essay culture, for example, in a terrific essay about that, and it's a culture that exists in part because of this book and the rest of her work, and it's something that's still, I remember when I was starting out as a writer, a personal essay was a way for you to introduce yourself to a publication or an editor if you didn't have a clip. You could have this essay, and if it was well done, on spec as they call it, and you sent it in, it was at least a way to show that you had a voice, you had a point of view, you could write something. And whether or not they took it, they might ask you to do something else. No one should work for $100
for 3,000.
I mean, it's but yeah. It's the reported part, right?
I know. It's like, no, I'll save you. Don't do that.
We're going to turn to questions in a minute, but I just wanted to pick up on something really interesting that you said, which is that, it is partly because of Didion that we have this proliferation of the personal essay culture. But one thing I was so struck by rereading the White Album, and it's something I think about with her all the time, is just how withholding she is, that there is something impersonal about her revelations. They're very carefully staged and enacted. And in the case of the White Album, I was slightly shocked to see how personal she quotes her own psychiatric evaluation. And there are things in it that are really details I had forgotten that feel very revealing about her sexual obsession and her obsessions with sex, et cetera. But the thing about that essay is that she stages her own nervous breakdown at the beginning, but the piece is not about her nervous breakdown. The piece is about the culture's nervous breakdown, right? And that's the work she's always doing, and that's what's still a little bit radical about her work too, is I think just how rigorous she is about pushing beyond the personal to the political, showing how the personal is political, let's say, not even creating that dichotomy, but really enacting it. And how, just because she's very, very careful about it. She is never what one might, as a writing teacher, sometimes call self-indulgent, right? Or maybe I shouldn't say never. She is. Perhaps in the Year of Magical Thinking.
Oh, no, I would.
You're
That's not what I mean at all. I think the Year of Magical Thinking was something that actually gave me a portrait of some of my own unprocessed grief from losing my father like 30 years ago. No, I think what I appreciate about that moment that you're talking about is that she's reporting herself.
Yeah, exactly.
She's sort of not even just relying on whatever she might think of herself. She's like, this is how I was characterized. Here's this report. She's treating herself as she would a subject that she was reporting on, and that is, I think, a distinction. It's certainly something that I made use of when I was working on my own essay collection, because I realized that the things that I was most sure of were usually the things that I was wrong about and needed to check on. The model of turning this kind of repertorial focus on the self was something that I definitely took from this book.
Morgan, what have you taken from Didion? And then we'll open it up.
I think what I've taken from Didion is that it's okay to interrogate. Just going back into, thinking about who could be the new Joan Didion. I think it's hard in the digital age to be able to interrogate without the fear of intense vitriolic backlash. And so for me, like, just reading about like her nervous breakdown, or reading about California and the water, how that works. I'm like, why do I need to know about that? But it just makes sense. This fear of this control, how we've seen it, just the packing list, and it's like conversations within conversations. So I think, what Joan Didion has taught me is that everything is connected. I know that's really woo-woo in a very general sense, but she does show, even in the midst of its chaos, what's happening in this neighborhood and what happened with this murder. It's all connected. So every time, I love it, like in conversations when I'm talking to someone and they're like, I know this is off topic, and I'm like, it's not.
Yeah.
Because something I must have said must have reminded you of something else, and I trust you enough to be able to make the link. So just keep talking. Like, I want to hear what you have to say. So, there's no such thing as tangents, I think.
The structure of disorder.
The structure of disorder.
This, that moment, one of my favorite moments in the essay is related to this idea you're talking about with the connections. On the morning of John Kennedy's death in 1963, I was buying at Ransohoff's in San Francisco a short silk dress in which to be married. A few years later, this dress of mine was ruined when, at a dinner party in Bel Air, Roman Polanski accidentally spilled a glass of red wine on it. Sharon Tate was also a guest at this party, although she and Roman Polanski were not yet married. On July 27th, 1970, I went to the Magnin High Shop on the third floor of iMagnin in Beverly Hills and picked out, at Linda Kasabian's request, the dress in which she began her testimony about the murders at Sharon Tate Polanski's house on Cielo Drive. Size 9 petite, her instructions read. Mini but not extremely mini. In velvet if possible, emerald green or gold, or a Mexican peasant-style dress, smocked or embroidered. She needed a dress that morning because the district attorney, Vincent Bugliosi, had expressed doubts about the dress she had planned to wear, a long white homespun shift. Long is for evening, he had advised Linda. Long was for evening, and white was for brides. And it goes on, but it's this kind of, she's following this trail that begins with her own wedding all the way to Linda Kasabian, the murder of Sharon Tate Polanski. It goes on to talk about how she's, the last moment is about how Roman Polanski and I are godparents to the same child.
Yeah, and it's like,
this kind of,
the vehicle is fashion. Like, you start and you're like, I don't care about your wedding dress, lady. And it's like, oh, okay. But see, you just have to be patient enough to let her take you there.
And right, exactly. And what other like the other new journalists like Tom Wolfe were not going to be writing about their wives' wedding dresses or using those details, I think. In
Not
quite
like
the same.
that.
I mean, Wolfe did in certain ways. We should open up to the audience. Yes, we have a few minutes for questions. Yes, in the back, over here.
That essay feels like not just to sort of break down society, but it kind of
Formal breakdown.
yes, a question of like the possibility of
Form.
narrative.
The last line is Roman Polanski and I are godparents of the same child, but writing has not yet helped me to see what it means. I'll repeat the question. The question is, it was a good question that was complicated.
the question was, where do I see her skepticism in this
About
essay
narrative.
about narrative in
Right.
relationship to her larger career?
Where
And
does it, how do we see
yeah.
it, right, affect her
the
entire
several
career?
Didion's
Yeah,
idea that
yeah.
I put forward. I think by the time that she writes Salvador, I think she is over that kind of skepticism. I think she is essentially willing to look at what she is afraid of looking at in this essay, which is the sort of the illusion of a democracy that was present at the time, and the way in which the military was the American government and the military were moving towards the state we're in now, which was this idea of putting the country in a permanent war. Like, Dick Cheney was a young staffer for Nixon, believed Nixon was wronged. This kind of, I think what we see in this essay is the roots of the moment we're in now, and someone trying to look at those roots as it was happening and being terrified of the implications of what of looking at what the whole story was underneath it all. I think by the time she gets to Salvador, by the time she gets to, certainly to after Henry, she is willing to look, Insider Baseball, her very famous essay about the presidential campaign of, I think, Dukakis.
I think.
Is now like one of the most copied kinds of essays. It's very common now to send a literary writer out with a candidate. We saw it almost too much during the last campaign, where I thought, I can't have another essay about being on the road with Trump. Like, it's just there was a forest of them, and still, it's I think now people are less hesitant to say the things she was saying, but she was moving towards it, and I think not quite willing to say it all, and then later I think she did.
Yeah, I feel like it's a seminal turning point. She says of this period of 1966 to 71, she later wrote, I think it's in Where I Was From, that in 1966 she became, quote, paralyzed by the conviction that the world as I had understood it no longer existed. I think many of us may feel this way today. If I was to work again at all, it would be necessary for me to come to terms with disorder, which I think is what you're talking about. And I think her work since then is a coming to terms with disorder, is a fascination with the structures of disorder. And I think formally you see that in a book that's much more explicitly grappling with the personal, which is The Year of Magical Thinking. Formally, you see it in how obsessively repetitious that book is, and how it privileges the detail, which actually led to critiques of her kind of privileging her own privilege, right, in that book, because there's a lot about where she and John Gregory Dunn went to dinner one night and the fancy clothes she was wearing. But yeah, I think it persists, that distrust or question of how the formal fascination with how rupturing narrative might lead to more thematic insight persists from there, and it manifests in slightly different ways, I think, but through through repetition quite often too, and through choice of subject like Salvador. Yeah, I think another question. There was a question up front here. Yeah.
I'm interested in the way that her books, these books that were definitive of the time, slash her first record and White Album, to me, even though those were troubled times, romanticized this period. I think in a way it's a little bit our prevalence, but I think and maybe part of that is pulling out, for her hanging out with the doors and driving around in the Corvette. It does seem romantic to me. And I'm wondering if you accept, will there be a collection that is definitive of this time that can seem romantic to someone 30 years from now, even though it weighs so heavily on us day to day? And if so, how much of that will be linked to the persona of that person?
Man, that was good. I love that question.
Yeah. The question is, her books, her seminal books about the 60s and 70s can seem to romanticize them. Do we agree with that premise? And if so, what might today's romanticizing of this moment?
So a couple of days ago, Susan Sarandon said, the great thing about Trump is that now we have more progressives
candidates.
and women of color running for office. And I was like, see, no. But I think if you have someone writing about this time, there may be a bit of romanticism with that in mind, with Ocasio-Cortez winning and the emergence of Julia Salazar and Cynthia Nixon, even though she didn't win, is providing a glimmer of hope. The hard thing is I think with Joan Didion, because I found that more in Slouch Towards Bethlehem, where she's talking about the addicts, and I'm like, okay, but I don't really know how to write about it other than just reporting it. I think it's hard to not romanticize when you're thinking about this particular setting, and maybe our cultural imagination towards certain places. So, talking about riding in a Corvette in, I don't know, in Wyoming, but I don't think has the same meaning as riding a Corvette in Hollywood. And I think the way we think about Hollywood is always like again, a paradise, and this sort of nativist myth that she's trying to shatter at the same time. So, yeah, I mean, I was about to say I'm going on a tangent, but I'm not. I'm going to get there. But, like, I think that, I do think that if there are going to be books about this particular time that's going to try to say that just because all of this like hellfire is happening in the Trump administration, these were the good things that were happening. Depending on your vantage point, you might be offended by that, or you might just say, well, yeah, but how do you balance that at the same time?
Right. I think if you are someone who's been separated from their child and is currently in detention, Susan Sarandon's comment sounds a little, if not a lot, off base. I think, also that she says that here, in this essay, in this light, all narrative was sentimental. In this light, all connections were equally meaningful and equally senseless. And that's her lead-in to her discussion of buying her wedding dress and that whole trail of thoughts that leads from her wedding dress to Linda Kasabian's dress for court. And I think that, she's very aware of how people take on these sentimental projections and what they do with them. And I think that the awareness that she's displaying in here is something that she then proceeded to interrogate perhaps for a good 30 years in her writing. And I think, again, it gets missed. I think a lot of times people look at her earliest work and they try to condemn that young woman that she was as being insufficient to the tasks that they want her to take on, while ignoring the fact that she actually took on many of those tasks.
What do you think? I have a question. Do you think it's like a coping mechanism now? Like it wasn't.
She talks about it as a coping mechanism.
Yeah, it's like it's not that bad, but it was that bad.
But it was that. It was not that bad, but it was that bad. She's talking about how at one point she says, I believed my life was sweet and sometimes it was, or something to that effect. And
but this is the rupture.
Yeah, this is the rupture. And, I do think that, when in crisis, yes, you reach for the sentimental, the consolation. You're reaching for the thing that consoles you. And that's what she's saying to us, that we need to mistrust whether we take that in or not.
I think it's really important to ask ourselves, where are we being bad readers of Didion? Because I think sometimes our own attention to those details is us being actually poor readers of Didion. Because when I reread this essay, it's so profoundly ironized at every step. So even the section with the doors, she ends up saying, I didn't continue hanging out, I didn't continue the project, right?
After that amazing detail.
After this, she's like, and then I stopped the project because, no. And so I think, but at the same time, it's maybe interesting about just the risks of beauty, right? She is a beautiful writer. We have to stop.
Oh, okay.
I think there's so much more to say.
I just wanted to quickly jump in and thank you all for this illuminating and thoughtful conversation. And also just to correct something I said earlier, I hope I will see you at BAM on November 28th through December 1st.
Okay.
But thank you all for being here. Thank you for this conversation. And please purchase their amazing books and get them signed.
Yeah, where are we signing books again?
Just downstairs in the lobby.
Okay. Book for sale right outside.
Yeah.